It starts like any other day until it doesn't. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Drop a comment below. It was just another routine morning in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina. The kind of morning where the sun begins to stretch across the city, casting soft golden hues over the cobbled streets, and people move in a predictable rhythm. But for Regina Monroe, that day would prove to be far from ordinary. As she stepped out of her car and made her way up the stone steps of the federal courthouse, there was no way she could know that this would be the day her life would shift in ways she never imagined. Regina was a seasoned judge, someone who had earned her place in the courtroom through years of diligence and dedication. She had seen countless cases, witnessed injustices, and made rulings that altered the course of lives. But today, she was not going to be judged for her decisions. She was going to be humiliated. As she walked toward the entrance, her sharp black blazer perfectly tailored, her polished shoes clicking in with confidence on the concrete, she held a sense of quiet power. But the moment she stepped up to the security checkpoint, the mood changed. The deputy, Michael Johnson, a man in his 40s, stood tall with a furrowed brow. He scanned Regina up and down, his gaze lingering on her, and something in him shifted. He didn't recognize her, and honestly, he didn't care to. He was just another man in power, secure in his beliefs that people like her didn't belong here, at least not in the capacity she thought she did. His words hit her like a slap, the kind of words meant to remind her, to put her in her place. "Ma'am, you need to step out of line." Regina paused, a calm but unwavering look crossing her face. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. He didn't answer immediately, letting the tension build between them. "You don't belong here," he muttered under his breath, and just like that it began, the humiliation that no one saw coming. But Regina knew, deep in her heart, that she was about to turn the tables. What this man didn't realize was that the woman he sought to degrade wasn't just a citizen caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, she wasn't just a woman in a courtroom on a mission to hear cases. She was the one who held the power to destroy him with nothing more than a single word. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courthouse, Regina Monroe felt a strange, almost surreal weight pressing down on her shoulders. Her heels clicked loudly against the marble floor as she followed the deputy into a small, windowless room just off the security area. The walls seemed to close in as she was led past the scanning equipment and the chairs, but her eyes never wavered. She held herself tall, her back straight, her posture unwavering in the face of the growing tension. There was a calm resolve in her that no one could see, but it burned hot within her chest, a fire stoked by the sheer injustice of it all. The deputy's hand was heavy on her arm, pulling her towards the steel chair in the center of the room. She stood still, her breath steady, as the sound of the clippers being prepared sliced through the air. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice steady, though there was a simmering rage beneath the calm surface. The deputy's answer came with the buzz of the clippers. "Standard procedure. You could be hiding something in that hair." The words were meant to belittle her, to assert control, to remind her that in this space, in this place of supposed law and order, she was nothing but another body, another target. Her hair, which had taken years to grow into the proud silver coils she wore so confidently, was now the reason for this violation, this invasion of her personal space. "I don't consent to this," Regina said firmly, but her words fell on deaf ears. The deputy and his companions, their faces set in grim lines, ignored her protest. She stood still, her mind racing, her body frozen in defiance as the cold vibration of the clippers pressed against her scalp. The strands of silver hair that had defined her, that were so deeply tied to her identity, her history, her family, fell away with every snip, each coil hitting the floor with a weight she could not describe. She felt the loss of each strand like a part of her past slipping away, like a piece of herself being stripped from her, but she refused to show any sign of weakness, not a flinch, not a tear. She sat there, her fists clenched tightly in her lap, her face an emotionless mask as her dignity was dismantled piece by piece. Laughter echoed from one of the officers in the room. "She looks better already," he sneered, his words cutting through the tense silence. But Regina didn't flinch. Instead, she stared straight ahead, the words they spoke, the actions they took. Nothing but background noise to her. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. As the last of her hair fell to the floor, the deputy made his final comment, wiping the loose strands from his sleeve. "Now you look more presentable." It was a small victory for him, a twisted sense of satisfaction. But Regina knew it was nothing more than an illusion of power. As the officers motioned her to leave the room, Regina rose slowly, her legs steady despite the turmoil inside. She walked back to the hallway, every step echoing like a declaration of defiance, her heart pounding, her pulse quickening, but her eyes focused ahead, locked on the task at hand. She wasn't just walking out of this room. She was walking into her power, into her purpose. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that this wasn't the end for her. This was just the beginning. She wasn't there to be broken. She was there to show them the kind of power they couldn't strip away, the kind of strength that didn't come from a badge or a title or even a robe. It came from within, and Regina Monroe knew exactly what she was capable of. With every step, she moved closer to the bench, closer to justice, closer to making sure that the people who had tried to break her would see just how wrong they were. As Regina Monroe stepped through the double doors into the courtroom, the world around her seemed to freeze. The noise from the hall ceased abruptly, as if time itself had momentarily paused to recognize the significance of her entrance. There was a heavy stillness in the air, one that clung to every corner of the room, suffocating the space with its tension. She moved forward with quiet authority, each step measured and deliberate, her shoes clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to something inevitable. The room, filled with lawyers, journalists, defendants, and plaintiffs, slowly began to notice her presence. At first, there was confusion. Some stared in disbelief, their eyes darting between her and the judge's bench, trying to reconcile the woman they had just seen escorted like a suspect, with the figure now standing before them in a role of undeniable power. It didn't take long for the realization to hit. The woman who had been humiliated moments ago, the woman whose dignity had been torn away, strand by strand, was not just another participant in this trial. She was the judge. She was the one who would determine the fate of the case, the one who held the gavel that would decide the outcome. The transformation was almost cinematic. The woman who had been violated in a small, cold room now stood tall in the very place where justice was dispensed. Regina approached the bench, her eyes scanning the room, noting the faces of those who had watched her be degraded, those who had stood by in silence while the system she had devoted her life to upholding turned its back on her. She didn't need to say anything. Her mere presence in the courtroom spoke volumes. With a steady hand, she reached for the robe folded neatly over the back of her chair, the same robe that symbolized the authority of her position, the same robe that had been stripped from her in the privacy of that windowless room. She didn't wait for anyone to assist her. She slipped the robe on herself, a silent declaration of power, of reclaiming what had been taken from her. As the fabric settled around her shoulders, it felt less like a garment and more like armor. She turned to the clerk, her voice calm and unwavering. "Is the docket ready?" she asked, her tone as precise as it was commanding. The clerk, visibly shaken, nodded, his voice barely audible as he responded, "Yes, Your Honor." Regina's eyes never left him, nor did they waver as she settled into the judge's seat. Her gaze moved across the room, taking in the shocked faces of the defense attorneys, the murmurs that rippled through the gallery. She was their judge now. It was as if the entire room held its breath, waiting for her to say something, to make her first move. And with that, she began. "We will begin today with preliminary testimony on Case 2371F, United States versus the Charleston Police Department," she stated, her voice even and measured. The weight of the room shifted, the atmosphere heavy with the realization that they were no longer witnessing a trial, they were witnessing a reckoning. The attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some with eyes wide open, others with a tinge of guilt on their faces, and a few with anger bubbling just beneath the surface. But Regina remained unfazed, her focus locked on the task ahead. She called the first witness, a police officer involved in a protest-related incident, but her mind was elsewhere. It wasn't just about this case, it was about something much bigger. It was about holding the system accountable, about reclaiming the power that had been denied to her for so long, and about ensuring that what had happened to her would never happen again. As she listened to the witness testify, her thoughts drifted back to the moment in the small, sterile room, to the officers who had thought they could break her. But they hadn't. They had only made her stronger. Regina knew that this trial, this moment in time, was hers. She had been given an opportunity to turn the tide, to show that justice was not just about following the law. It was about ensuring that everyone, no matter their skin color, no matter their gender, had a right to dignity, respect, and equality. She had taken her seat, not as a judge who had been broken, but as a woman who had been reborn. The courtroom, once filled with judgment and silence, was now filled with something different, the undeniable presence of someone who would no longer be silenced. Regina Monroe's steady hand gripped the gavel, the cold, smooth wood familiar under her fingers. The courtroom, still charged with the reverberations of her unexpected entrance, now lay in a tense hush. She was no longer just a passive observer, nor was she the object of ridicule or humiliation. She was the one who commanded the room. With the force of her presence alone, she had already begun to shift the balance of power. The case before her was not just about police misconduct. It was the catalyst for something much larger, a turning point in both her life and in the lives of those who had witnessed her disgrace. As she listened to the testimonies, each word, each piece of evidence felt like an anchor, pulling her further into the role she had always been meant to play, one of purpose and justice. The officers, now testifying under her watchful eye, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Regina could feel their nervous energy from the bench. The one who had mocked her, Deputy Riker, was among them. His presence, so sure of itself only hours earlier, now seemed small and fragile in the face of the woman he had sought to strip of her dignity. He avoided her gaze, his hands twitching at his sides, but Regina did not look away. Her eyes were calm, but they were also unwavering, locking on to him with a silent message he could no longer ignore. This was no longer a courtroom where the officers held the power. It was hers, and she would wield it with precision. As the witnesses continued to speak, Regina's mind was sharp, her thoughts focused on each word, each argument, but she knew what had to happen next. She had to hold Riker accountable, and she knew that doing so would send a message not only to him, but to the entire system that had allowed him to act with impunity for so long. She cleared her throat, and the room fell even quieter. "Deputy Riker," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. His body stiffened, and for the first time he met her gaze. It was a brief moment, but in that instant, Regina saw something she had never seen before in him. Fear. Fear of the truth. "You will stay after the recess," Regina instructed, her tone unyielding. The words felt like a sentence, and Riker could do nothing but nod, his face pale, his mouth trembling with uncertainty. The trial continued, but Regina's mind was already far ahead, preparing for the moment when she would confront him. When the recess was called, the room emptied slowly, and Regina sat back in her chair, her mind turning over the evidence she had heard. She knew there was more to this than just Riker's actions. This was about the deeper issues within the courthouse, the system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for years. She had seen the files, the complaints that had been buried, the victims whose voices had been silenced. Now it was time to unearth those voices, to give them the platform they had been denied. As the courtroom began to refill, Regina's heart beat with determination. She could feel the weight of her role more now than ever before. This wasn't just about a single officer's abuse of power. It was about all the abuses that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. The evidence was mounting, and Regina knew what she had to do. She turned her gaze to Riker once more as he slowly made his way back into the room. His demeanor deflated, his once proud stance reduced to one of submission. His eyes darted around the courtroom, but he could no longer find the confidence he had carried so effortlessly earlier. It was in this moment that Regina realized the full scope of what she was doing, not just to him, but to the very system that had shielded him for so long. She had not only reclaimed her own dignity, she had become the agent of change that this courthouse needed. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was a force for justice. The time had come. When the room was silent again, Regina's voice rang out with a clarity and power that left no room for doubt. "Deputy Riker, you are hereby suspended from your duties, effective immediately, pending further investigation," she declared, her words echoing in the stillness. The officers who had remained quiet, watching from the sidelines, now seemed to take notice. This was a turning point, not just for Riker, But for them as well, the balance of power was shifting, and there was no going back. Regina Monroe had spoken, and she would make sure that justice at long last would be served. Regina Monroe's decision to institute the Monroe Mandate felt like the first true act of justice she had been able to deliver in her career. It wasn't enough just to deal with Deputy Riker. The system had allowed him, and others like him, to thrive in their unchecked power for far too long. What happened to her that morning in the security room was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger systemic issue that ran deep within the courthouse. The very institution she had dedicated her life to was complicit in the mistreatment of individuals like her, and it had ignored the cries of those who had suffered at the hands of those sworn to uphold the law. She was determined to change that. The Monroe Mandate was not just a set of rules. It was a declaration that the time for complacency and silence had ended. It was a promise that the courthouse would no longer tolerate discrimination, that bias would be actively addressed, and that every person who walked through those doors, no matter their race, gender, or background, would be treated with dignity and respect. It wasn't just about preventing future injustices. It was about acknowledging the wrongs that had already been done and ensuring they would never be swept under the rug again. Regina spent hours drafting the mandate, outlining a comprehensive approach to combating bias within the courthouse. The policy called for anti-bias training for all courthouse personnel, mandatory psychological evaluations, and regular assessments to ensure that the system was not perpetuating harmful patterns. The mandate also included clear procedures for filing complaints and a zero-tolerance policy for any form of discriminatory behavior. But Regina knew that instituting a policy was just the beginning. For the mandate to have any real impact, it needed to be enforced, and that meant holding those in power accountable, not just those who had been caught in the act, but also those who had turned a blind eye for years. She would not allow the people who had been complicit in Riker's behavior to escape scrutiny. That meant pushing for an investigation into the judges, the officers, and anyone else who had allowed such misconduct to continue. She wasn't naive enough to believe that it would be easy or that everyone would be happy with the changes she was demanding. The resistance would come from all corners. There would be whispers in the halls, attempts to undermine her at every turn. But Regina wasn't afraid. In fact, she welcomed it. The harder they fought against her, the more determined she became. She knew that the road to real change was never smooth, and she had already walked through the fire. What they didn't understand was that she wasn't doing this for recognition or for accolades. She was doing this because it was the right thing to do. Every word in the Monroe Mandate was driven by the belief that justice was not just about punishment, it was about transformation. It was about creating a system where everyone was treated equally, where the voices of the oppressed were heard, and where the powerful could no longer hide behind their badges and titles. The media caught wind of the mandate soon after its introduction, and the response was overwhelming. News outlets across the country hailed Regina for her bravery and vision. But it wasn't the praise that mattered to her. It was the lives that would be changed because of this policy, the countless individuals who would no longer have to fear entering a place that was supposed to protect them. The Monroe Mandate was about more than just one courthouse. It was about setting a precedent, sending a message that things were different now. And as the calls came in from other cities, other courthouses asking for guidance on implementing similar policies, Regina knew that the ripples of her actions would spread far beyond Charleston. She was no longer just a judge. She had become a symbol of accountability, of the possibility of change in a system that often felt too broken to fix. But this wasn't just her fight anymore. It had become a movement, one that would continue to grow as more and more people began to recognize that they too had the power to demand change. As the weeks passed, Regina stood firm in the knowledge that her actions, her mandate, were only the beginning. She was ready for whatever came next because she knew that true justice, the kind that could heal deep wounds and rebuild broken systems, wasn't just something that happened in courtrooms. It was something that began in the heart, and she had found her heart's true purpose. The courtroom was no longer the same. The walls that once stood as silent witnesses to countless cases of injustice now seemed to echo with a different energy, an energy that was both heavy and charged with anticipation. Regina Monroe had become more than just a judge. She had become the catalyst for a reckoning that rippled far beyond the walls of the courthouse. As the investigation into Deputy Riker's misconduct deepened, The magnitude of what she had set in motion began to unfold. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everything that had allowed him and others like him to operate without fear of consequence. It was about the silence that had protected them, the system that had turned a blind eye to the suffering of those who dared to challenge the status quo. What Regina hadn't anticipated, however, was how far the resistance would go. There were those who had long since grown comfortable with the way things worked in the courthouse, those who had turned a blind eye, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of indifference. They whispered in corners, behind closed doors, trying to undermine her efforts, trying to push her back into the shadows where she had once been relegated. But Regina wasn't afraid. In fact, she welcomed it. Every pushback only fueled her resolve. She knew the stakes were higher than they had ever been. This was not a fight that could be won with silence or compromise. This was a fight that demanded unwavering dedication, and Regina was prepared to give everything she had. As the investigation into Riker continued, more voices began to emerge. Voices from within the courthouse, from those who had seen the corruption firsthand but had been too afraid to speak out. One by one, they came forward, sharing their stories of what they had witnessed, of the toxic culture that had been allowed to fester unchecked for years. The accounts were harrowing: officers who had targeted minority groups, judges who had dismissed complaints, clerks who had quietly ignored injustices because it was easier to stay silent than to rock the boat. Each story added another layer to the case, another piece to the puzzle that was slowly revealing the full extent of the rot within the system. Regina had always known that the truth was powerful, but what she hadn't expected was the sheer force of it when it was finally unleashed. It was like a dam breaking open, flooding the courtroom with the voices of the silenced. For years, these people had lived in fear, their cries for help ignored, their pain dismissed. But now they had a voice, and that voice was being heard. The deeper the investigation went, the more Regina realized that this was no longer just about cleaning up one courthouse. It was about dismantling a culture of corruption that had been allowed to thrive unchecked. She knew that she couldn't do it alone. It would take a collective effort, a united front of people willing to speak out, to stand together and demand real change. The pressure mounted, but Regina's resolve remained steadfast. She worked tirelessly, poring over documents, listening to testimonies, coordinating with federal agencies, and speaking with those brave enough to come forward. It was exhausting work, but every step forward felt like a victory. It wasn't just about the legal cases anymore. It was about something much larger. It was about holding the entire system accountable for the wrongs that had been done. In the midst of this, a sense of solidarity began to form among those who had once been too afraid to speak out. Lawyers, activists, community leaders, and even some of the courthouse staff began to rally around Regina, offering their support and their voices to the cause. What had once felt like an insurmountable challenge was slowly turning into a movement. People were beginning to see that Regina wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all of them, for those who had been silenced, for those who had suffered, for those who had been invisible for too long. The courtroom became a battleground, not just for justice, but for the very soul of the system. It was a battle that Regina knew would not be won overnight, but she was ready. She had come too far, and she knew that the fight for accountability, for truth, for change, was a fight worth fighting no matter how long it took. As the investigation unfolded and more witnesses came forward, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The truth was undeniable. The courthouse, the system that had been built to uphold justice, had instead been complicit in perpetuating injustice. It was a painful truth to swallow, but it was one that Regina would not shy away from. She was determined to ensure that the voices of the oppressed would never again be silenced. The fight for justice was far from over, but Regina Monroe had ignited a spark that could never be extinguished. Regina Monroe sat in her chambers, her fingers resting lightly on the edges of the file in front of her, the weight of it pressing into her mind. She had spent weeks pushing the Monroe Mandate forward, instituting sweeping reforms within the courthouse, demanding accountability at every turn. But as the news of her actions began to spread, the repercussions of her decisions became ever more profound. The stories of the victims, once hidden in the shadows, had reached the public eye, and with them came the tidal wave of support and resistance alike. The courthouse was never the same after the truth was laid bare. The very walls that had once protected the corrupt were now filled with whispers of change. Regina knew that the public's eyes were now on her, but she wasn't concerned with the media's sensationalism or the politicians' promises. What mattered to her was the legacy of what she had started, the real, tangible change that could reshape the very foundation of the justice system. The hearings into Deputy Riker had become a symbol of her commitment, but it was the investigation that followed, the one that uncovered years of buried complaints and hidden corruption, that would define her impact. It was a slow process, each discovery unraveling decades of systemic abuse. The victims who had come forward now had a voice, and with it, they were demanding the attention they had long been denied. These were not just nameless faces, they were fathers, mothers, children, neighbors, and community leaders who had suffered, whose lives had been irrevocably altered by the very system that was meant to protect them. With each new name added to the list of complaints, with each new testimony given in front of Regina, the truth became clearer. This wasn't just about reforming one courthouse. It was about reforming a culture that had turned a blind eye to the suffering of so many for far too long. Regina didn't stop with just the courthouse. She expanded the investigation, calling on federal agencies, community organizations, and activists to help uncover the full extent of the corruption. It was a massive undertaking, but the momentum she had built, the network of allies she had formed, carried them through. She had gone from being the object of scorn to becoming a beacon of hope for many. The weight of what she was doing was not lost on her. She had become a symbol of resistance, not just against the individual acts of misconduct, but against the entire system that allowed them to fester. She had a target on her back now, one that grew larger with every move she made, but she didn't care. Regina knew that true justice required sacrifice. She had made peace with that. Yet, it was the personal connections she had forged along the way that kept her grounded. The young intern who had testified, the former courthouse employee who bravely spoke out, these were the moments that mattered most to Regina. The support of those who had suffered alongside her was what drove her forward, reminding her that she was not alone. And then, there were the protesters. They had stood outside the courthouse, their signs calling for justice, their voices a collective roar that could not be ignored. They were the face of the people, demanding the change that had long been denied to them. Regina never forgot the look in their eyes, the hope, the determination. They weren't just fighting for justice, they were fighting for their dignity, for their humanity, and Regina had given them that hope. She had given them a voice. As the months passed, the changes began to take root. The Monroe Mandate spread beyond Charleston, adopted by other courthouses, cities, and even states. It became a movement that was rooted in accountability, transparency, and the unwavering belief that justice was for all, not just the powerful. The media continued to report on her every move, but Regina didn't care about the headlines anymore. She knew that the true impact of her work would be measured not in stories written about her, but in the lives that were changed because of her actions. She had ignited a fire that would continue to burn long after she was gone. It was no longer about the courtroom. It was about the people who had suffered, about ensuring that their pain was acknowledged, that their voices would never again be silenced. The fight for justice, for equality, for dignity. Regina had started a revolution, and though the road ahead was still long and uncertain, she knew that the course had been set. The system had been cracked open, and there was no going back. The weight of her decisions was heavy, but in that weight, Regina found her strength. It was a strength that came not from the robe she wore, nor the gavel she held, but from the unwavering belief that justice was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed insurmountable. The world was changing, and Regina Monroe had been the one to spark that change.